The notebook was waterlogged. The ink had bled into the paper so badly that some pages were nearly unreadable. But the words at the back, the final pages, were written in careful, deliberate English. Not Japanese. English. A Japanese soldier, somewhere in the Pacific, had written his last message in the language of the enemy. He knew he was going to die. He knew an American would find his body. And so he wrote to that American directly. What he asked for was not mercy. It was something quieter, and far more devastating than that. Here is a fact that almost no one knows, and it changes everything about what you are about to hear. The American military forbade its soldiers from keeping personal diaries, strictly, formally, by order. The fear was practical. If a diary fell into enemy hands, it could reveal troop positions, morale levels, planned operations. American soldiers who kept diaries anyway did so illegally, hiding them from their own officers. The Japanese military did the opposite. Japan's Imperial Army not only permitted diary keeping, it encouraged it. Diaries were distributed to soldiers at New Year's. Officers expected them to be maintained. The act of writing down your days, your thoughts, your inner world, was considered a reflection of discipline and proper spirit. A soldier who kept a careful diary was, in some sense, a good soldier. This created something the Japanese military almost certainly did not intend. It created a paper trail. An enormous, sprawling, intimate paper trail of what the war actually looked and felt and smelled like from inside. Not from the general's maps, not from the propaganda broadcasts, but from the men lying in the mud with their notebooks propped against their knees. When those soldiers died, the Americans found the diaries. Hundreds of them, pulled from the pockets of the dead, retrieved from bunkers, salvaged from the sea. Some were blood-stained. Some had been soaked in salt water until the pages swelled and warped. Some were still dry, tucked inside a jacket against the body, protected almost to the end. And then the Americans did what governments do with the private words of their enemies. They read them. His name was Donald Keene. He was a young American naval intelligence officer, barely into his 20s, assigned to translate captured Japanese documents during the Pacific War. Most of what he processed was, as he later described it, militarily useless. Unit schedules, logistical notes, observations outdated by the time they were translated. The intelligence value of any single diary was often minimal. But Keene kept reading. He read the diary of a soldier who recorded his days in the rigid, obedient style of a man performing correctness. 6 in the morning, got up, 6:15, washed my face. Entries so precise and empty, they told him almost nothing about what the man actually felt. He read diaries full of official phrases, the clichés of imperial propaganda, soldiers who had absorbed the language of the state so completely that even their private writing sounded like a bulletin board. And then he read the others. He read a diary written in what he described as nearly illiterate handwriting, rough and cramped and barely schooled, by a soldier who recorded the New Year's meal shared by the 7 survivors of his entire company. They had 13 beans between them, 13 beans divided among 7 men, and the soldier wrote it down. Not with anger, Keene noted later, not with bitterness or political outrage, just, here is what happened, here is what we had, here is the day. He said later that this entry, from a man with almost no education and almost no literary skill, was unbearably moving in a way that none of the polished, correct, propaganda-soaked diaries ever were. Because the man couldn't dress it up. He only had the truth. Keene had been trained to find intelligence. What he found instead was something that would redirect the entire course of his life. A question he could not shake loose, no matter how many decades passed. What does a man write when he knows he is about to die, and knows the enemy will be the only one who reads it? The diary from Mackinac Atoll survives in the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. It was translated by U.S. military intelligence. The soldier who kept it has never been identified. He was stationed on a small group of islands just south of the Marshall Islands, part of Japan's outer Pacific defenses. The American operation to take those islands, Operation Galvanic, began in November 1943. The soldier knew it was coming. His entries from those final days are not the words of a man who believed in inevitable Japanese victory. They are the words of a man counting down. On November 20th, 1943, he wrote about the first American carrier planes arriving, 32 of them, sighted at 3:15 in the morning, wave after wave of bombings through the day, until the entire installation was, in his words, completely wrecked. He observed them clinically, almost like a man taking notes on weather. 4 planes at a time, he wrote, coming in with the sun behind them. By November 25th, he wrote this: "Even though we are alive, we figure we will only live about 2 or 3 days. All of us put the muzzle of the gun to our throats several times, but however eventually we will die, so why not just stick it out to the finish?" Read that again quietly. These men had already held their rifles to their own throats, multiple times, and they had decided each time to put the gun down, not because they believed they would survive, but because they had decided that if death was coming anyway, they would let it come on its own terms. The entry is written in present tense, calm, almost conversational. The handwriting does not change. Whatever storm was happening inside that man, his hand remained steady. His last recorded entry cuts off mid-sentence. The rest of the pages are blank. He was never found, never identified. The diary sat in a military archive for decades before an archivist named Greg Bradshaw came across it, while looking for something else entirely, and recognized what it was. But the Macon Atoll diary is only one voice. And the story Keene was building was not about one man, it was about a pattern he kept encountering across hundreds of documents, a pattern that contradicted almost everything the official Japanese military narrative insisted was true. The propaganda said Japanese soldiers were devoted, fearless, unified in their willingness to die for the emperor. The propaganda said the spirit of Bushido, the warrior code, made the Japanese soldier a different kind of fighting man, one who did not fear death the way Western soldiers did, one who welcomed it. The diaries said something else entirely. They said, "I am all alone, and it is pretty lonely." They said, "I am hungry, and I cannot remember what it felt like to not be cold." They said, "I wonder if my mother knows where I am." They said these things in the same notebooks the military had issued as proof of discipline, in the same handwriting men had learned in schoolrooms decorated with portraits of the emperor, in the same careful Japanese characters that official culture had taught them to form beautifully and exactly. The form was correct, the content was human, and it was the humanity that neither side in this war quite knew what to do with. Keene translated one entry in which a soldier described stealing chocolate from dead American soldiers. He was not describing it as shameful. He was describing it as survival. The enemy's chocolate, the enemy's supplies, became, in the most practical and quiet way, part of what kept a Japanese soldier alive for one more day on an island that was already lost. Hit subscribe right now, because what he admitted next changes everything. Do not go anywhere. Here is where the open loop closes. Some of the diaries Keene translated contained something he had not expected and could not entirely process, even years later when he wrote about it. At the back of certain notebooks, not all, but enough to form a pattern, soldiers had written messages in English. Careful English. Deliberate, addressed English, written by men who had studied the language in school and were now using it for the last time in their lives, for an audience of exactly one. The audience was the American soldier who would find the body. The messages varied, but Keene described their core request in terms that he clearly found difficult to set aside cleanly as a professional translator. They asked the finder to send the diary to the writer's family in Japan when the war ended. That was the ask. Not for mercy, not for prayers, not for acknowledgement of their courage or their sacrifice. They wanted the notebook to go home. They wanted the people they loved to know that they had been here, that they had written things down, that they had been thinking of them at the end. Imagine what that act required. To sit with a rifle and a government-issued notebook in a position you knew was about to be overrun, and to flip to the back of the book, and to write in a foreign language to a man you had never met and would never meet, trusting that the same enemy you had been trained to fear and to fight would honor a dead man's last request. There was no guarantee, there was no reason, strategically or logically, to believe an American soldier would do this. Japan's own propaganda had told its soldiers, explicitly, that Americans were barbaric, that they would mutilate the bodies of the enemy dead. Some soldiers believed this. The diaries record it. And yet something in these men, at the very end, overrode the propaganda. They chose to believe, against all the evidence they had been given, that the man who found them might be decent enough to carry a notebook across an ocean. Keene decided he would be that man. He began, quietly and illegally, to set aside certain diaries, not for military analysis, for return. He intended to find a way, after the war, to get these notebooks back to the families who had last seen their sons or husbands or brothers board a ship and sail away. It was against regulations. He knew this. Military captured documents were property of the United States government, classified materials, not personal correspondence to be mailed across a former battlefield to enemy civilians. Keene understood all of this, and quietly kept doing it anyway, because the men who had written those English pages had trusted that something human would outlast the war. He intended to be that something. While he was in Okinawa, the diaries he had set aside were discovered. They were confiscated. He never learned where they went. He never knew if any of those notebooks made it to Japan, to the families who had been waiting in the long silence for any word at all. For the rest of his life, and he lived to 96 years old, Keene carried that unresolved question. The men who wrote those English pages had trusted the enemy with their last wish. The enemy had tried to honor it. And then the machinery of war had taken even that small act of grace and filed it somewhere. The diaries are almost certainly still in an archive, cataloged, preserved, untranslated in the back pages, waiting. Remember what this story was supposed to be about. An American military officer assigned to extract intelligence from captured enemy documents. A job. A wartime function, in and out. Keene could not leave. He described the men who wrote those diaries as the first Japanese he ever knew intimately, and they were all dead by the time he read their words. That intimacy, built entirely from one-sided pages, from voices that could not hear him respond, from handwriting pressed into waterlogged paper by men who had no idea that a young American from New York would spend his life trying to carry their thoughts forward. That intimacy became the organizing fact of his existence. After the war, he became a scholar of Japanese literature, then a translator, then one of the most celebrated interpreters of Japanese civilization in the English-speaking world. He wrote dozens of books. He translated poetry and theater and fiction, spanning 1,000 years. He moved to Japan. He received the Order of the Rising Sun, one of Japan's highest honors. He wrote a biography of Emperor Meiji, the man whose grandson had presided over the war that had given Keene those first waterlogged notebooks. In 2011, after the Tohoku earthquake devastated Japan, Keene renounced his American citizenship and became a Japanese national. He said he wanted to share Japan's suffering. He was 88 years old. The men who wrote in their government-issued notebooks about 13 beans and New Year's and the sound of American planes coming in with the sun behind them, those men had died before they could know what they had set in motion. They had written honestly, probably because they could not help it, inside a container that was supposed to prove their loyalty, and had instead preserved their humanity. And that humanity had reached across the water, across the enemy line, across the decades, and unmade a young American's certainty about where he belonged in the world. The Macon Atoll diary ends in the middle of a sentence. We do not know what the soldier was writing. We do not know his name. We know he was there in November 1943, that he had watched American planes dismantle his position wave by wave, that he had held a rifle to his throat and put it down again, that he had decided to wait for the end rather than choose it himself. And then the sentence stopped, and the pages after it were blank, and that was all. Somewhere in the Pacific, in the coral, in the sand, in an archive box in Maryland, there are voices like his still waiting. Men who wrote to the enemy in careful English. Men who split 13 beans into 7 portions and recorded the number. Men whose last act of trust was to flip to the back of a notebook and believe, against every reason they had been given, that the man on the other side of the war was someone who would understand what it meant to want your family to know you had been thinking of them. This is what the secret diaries left behind. Not military intelligence. Not the evidence of fanaticism the propaganda on both sides had promised. Just men, afraid, cold, hungry, and aching for home, writing the truth in whatever language they thought might carry it farthest. The diaries were supposed to prove loyalty. Instead, they proved something far more durable. That even inside a war designed to make the enemy into something less than human, the humans kept writing. If this story stayed with you, and I think it did, subscribe now and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Every week, we come back here and tell the war through the eyes of those who lost it. Not to relitigate who was right, but to find what the official histories leave out. Hit the like button if this one earned it. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We read every single one. We'll see you in the next one.